Today we're talking about the game Square Enix wants you to forget. The game that Clair Obscur Expedition 33 used as creative inspiration. This is the story of Lost Odyssey, the unfortunately Temu sounding Final Fantasy knockoff that ended up being more authentic than the original brand. In the mid-2000s, Square Enix was in a state of quiet panic. The industry was shifting under their feet. High-definition development costs were exploding. The Xbox 360 was aggressively knocking on Japan's door. And more importantly, Hironobu Sakaguchi, the man who defined the Final Fantasy formula, had just walked away. The company responded to this identity crisis by chasing spectacle, proprietary engines, and mass market appeal. But while Square was busy building crystal tools and turning their flagship series into a series of high-fidelity hallways, Sakaguchi was doing the exact opposite. He founded Mistwalker, recruited the legendary composer Nobuo Uematsu, and set out to build a game that Square Enix was too afraid to make. Let's be honest, if you saw Lost Odyssey or the last story sitting on a shelf without knowing the pedigree behind them, you'd think you were looking at some Temu-ass Final Fantasy knockoff. My friend asked what I was playing recently. When I said the name Lost Odyssey out loud, I physically winced. It sounded like an Alibaba version of Final Fantasy, and it's so on the nose that it borders on satire. But there's a fascinating, almost petty reason for this. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the man who literally gave life into the Final Fantasy franchise, was effectively saying, I can't keep the house, but I'm taking the blueprint with me. The last story is quite literally a synonym for Final Fantasy. Lost Odyssey is a direct echo of the grand ancient storytelling that the fantasy name used to represent before it became a corporate juggernaut. The tragedy here is that these names, these great value titles, likely buried the game's legacy before it even had a chance. In a market dominated by established IPs and massive marketing budgets, Lost Odyssey sounded like a placeholder. It sounded like a game that was trying to be something else, but the irony is that it wasn't trying to be Final Fantasy. It was Final Fantasy. The branding was a quiet middle finger to the corporate giants at Square Enix. It was a declaration that the soul of a series doesn't belong to a trademark, it belongs to the creators. Unfortunately, that fuck you to the industry meant that the game would struggle to find an audience outside the hardcore Sakaguchi loyalists, leaving it lost on a console that the Japanese market barely acknowledged. The technical DNA of Lost Odyssey is a complete anomaly. In 2007, Unreal Engine 3 was the Gears of War and Batman Arkham series engine. It was built for gray, gritty, testosterone-fueled action games. It was engineered specifically to render thick men in suits, pause, chunky metallic environments, and the brownish-gray mud of a post-apocalyptic battlefield. It was arguably the worst possible choice for a flamboyant, emotional JRPG filled with flowing silk, intricate jewelry, and hair that actually needs to move. But this is where the love and care you can feel in this game really shines. Square Enix spent a reported $50 to $75 million on Final Fantasy XIII, building their proprietary Crystal Tools engine just so Lightning's hair could look like a pre-rendered movie. Mistwalker, working with a fraction of that budget, roughly $20 million, forced Unreal Engine 3 to do things it wasn't designed for. Playing this today on the Xenia emulator at 4K and 60 FPS is a revelation, because we've hit a massive plateau in graphical fidelity. Since the jump from PS4 to PS5 is barely noticeable, Lost Odyssey looks surprisingly modern. Yes, the box art is a disaster. Kaim's face on the packaging is the definition of the Uncanny Valley, likely because the developers struggled to translate Takehiko Inoue's hyper-realistic gritty manga art into 2008 polygons, but in-game, it's stunning. The transition in the opening Highlands battle from a high-budget pre-rendered cinematic straight into the gameplay is still a wow moment. In Final Fantasy XIII, the gap between CGI and the gameplay is honestly jarring. It's damn near an immersion-breaking chasm. In Lost Odyssey, the two feel like they belong to the same world. It's cohesive. It proves that a game doesn't need a $100 million budget to look next-gen if the art direction is focused. It was a game made with an artisan's touch rather than a corporate mandate to homogenize everything into Unreal Engine 5 slop. Modern gaming is currently obsessed with what I call the lobotomy marker. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's that giant glowing objective icon that hovers on your screen 24/7, or the yellow marker trail on the walls that tells you exactly where to walk. Modern developers are terrified, absolutely paralyzed by the thought that if you're left to your own devices for more than 5 seconds, you'll get confused, close the game, and never come back. Lost Odyssey respects your intelligence. It doesn't give a fuck about your modern, short-form, content-fried attention span. The combat is a traditional, tactical turn-based system that requires you to actually pay attention to what's happening on your screen. The aim ring system is a perfect example of this. It's a precursor to the timing-based mechanics we're seeing in Expedition 33. It keeps you physically engaged with the rhythm of the fight without turning the game into mindless press X slop action RPGs. But where the game really differentiates itself from modern soulless titles is the difficulty curve. This game is weirdly balanced. Disc 1 is a notorious gatekeeper. If you haven't mastered the mechanics by the time you reach the Grigorous boss on the mountain, the game will happily kick your teeth in. It's a Dark Souls moment in a genre that usually babies its players. I've recently fought the 5 Arthrosauruses, monsters that can wipe your entire party with a single 2200 HP fire breath attack, each one coming one after the other with no save points nor auto-healing in between. I finished that fight with exactly 183 HP left on Seth, surviving only because I managed to land a basic attack at the perfect moment. That feeling of genuine accomplishment, the literal sigh of relief when you finally reach a save point and can take a load off for the day, is something that has been completely polished out of modern gaming. Lost Odyssey requires you to struggle, to fail, and to eventually overcome. By removing the lobotomy markers and the hand holding, it creates a sense of presence that Square Enix hasn't captured in decades. In the hands of almost any other studio today, especially within the current landscape of Western modernized writing, a character like Jansen Freed would be an absolute disaster. On paper, he's a walking embodiment of a cringe trope. He's a womanizing, heavy-drinking, loudmouth, comedic relief spy. In a lesser game, he would be the character you're constantly trying to mute or skip past. He'd be the guy making the same 3 cringy-ass jokes for 60 hours until you lose all empathy for the party. But Lost Odyssey does something that modern Final Fantasy titles seem to have forgotten how to do. It gives the comedic relief a soul. Jansen is the bridge between the player and a group of protagonists who have literally been traumatized by a millennium of existence. His journey from a cynical, self-serving spy to the big booba lady's husband and a core pillar of the group is one of the most rewarding character arcs in JRPG history. His relationship with Big Booba Lady is arguably the heart of this game's second half. It doesn't feel like a forced waifu subplot. When they finally get married, it's a moment of genuine warmth in a world that is often cold and bleak. Jansen is the human element in a story about gods. He proves that you can have humor and levity without sacrificing character depth. Compare that to the brooding protagonists we've seen lately, characters who act like Cloud Strife but lack the suicidal trauma that made Cloud's stoicism make sense. Jansen is a mess, but he's a human mess, and that makes him more relatable than a dozen hyper-polished cool protagonists combined. The core of Lost Odyssey is a meditation on the sheer crushing weight of time. Even if the reels and shorts ruined your attention span, forcing you to skip half of the 1,000 years of dreams, the vibe of those stories permeates every frame of the game. These aren't just surface level woke checkboxes we see in modern titles. They are a ledger of 1,000 years of war, racism, idiocy, beauty, and loss. When you see Kaim brooding, it's not because he's trying to look edgy for the camera. He's brooding because he's watched 99% of the people he has ever loved die. He's seen the futility of human pursuits over and over again. This depth of a character is something sorely lacking in modern titles that rely on spectacle over substance. In Lost Odyssey, when Kaim finally encounters something that conjures an emotional reaction, it hits 10 times harder because we understand the vacuum of grief he's been living in. The ending of this game is perhaps the most uncorporate thing about it. In a typical soulless blockbuster, the hero saves the world and becomes a legendary king or god. But Kaim and Sarah, They turn down the political roles. They've seen enough empires rise and fall to know that power is a trap. They choose a quiet, simple family life, and they find peace after centuries of wandering. Even the conclusion of their immortal status is handled with a sense of maturity. Despite the tension of their long lives, Kaim's final realization that eternity isn't so bad only works because he's finally found something worth staying for. The game ends on a note of hope and human connection rather than the despair of their infinite lifespan. It feels complete. It's a tragic one-off that respects the player enough to actually end, rather than being stretched out into a decade-long franchise that pushes out perpetual sequels for monetary gain. For years, Lost Odyssey felt like a relic of a dead era, the lost masterpiece on a console that didn't deserve it. But recently the tide has started to turn. Most people compare Expedition 33 to Final Fantasy X, but a developer directly quoted Lost Odyssey as their primary inspiration. That is a massive "I told you so" to the industry. While Square Enix was busy trying to turn Final Fantasy XVI into a hybrid of Game of Thrones and Devil May Cry 5, a new generation of developers realized that the true meaning of the genre, the art of the JRPG, was found in the tactical, emotional, and unapologetically turn-based DNA of Sakaguchi's work. Expedition 33 is carrying a torch that Square Enix dropped 20 years ago. But the most shocking twist in this Odyssey happened just recently. After a decade of Mistwalker's only new title being an Apple Arcade exclusive, the impossible happened. Mistwalker and Square Enix partnered up, with Square publishing the console port of Fantasian. The implications are staggering. This is the first time the father of Final Fantasy and the house of Final Fantasy have held hands since the messy divorce. Whether this leads to a dark fantasy sequel to Fantasian or a permanent reunion, it's the most hopeful the genre has looked in a long time. It proves that you can't keep a good formula down. Square Enix might have wanted you to forget Lost Odyssey, but the rest of the world didn't. If we're lucky, we're entering a new golden age where Mistwalker and Square work together to bring the soul back to the forefront. Or in true Sakaguchi fashion, his next masterpiece will be his greatest work yet, but it'll only be playable through Microsoft Copilot. Either way, I'll be there for it, because if Lost Odyssey taught me anything, is that some things are worth waiting 1,000 years for.